They actually sent one. Supervisor Den's crest feathers were flattened in amusement against his narrow skull, and Kess Toralin heard the laughter rolling through Bay 14 before she even rounded the corner. A single human for the full certification audit. The room was a long, low-ceilinged technical bay aboard the Veshan Interstellar Licensing Authority's orbital station. Its 9 inspection consoles arranged in the formal arc prescribed by compact regulation, each surface polished to a reflective sheen under the pale blue glow of overhead diagnostics panels. 9 senior technicians stood behind those consoles in their formal audit armor, crests in various configurations of amusement. Kess was the newest among them, 3 rotations out of accreditation school, and she was still learning which silences in this place were comfortable and which were political. This one was neither. It was gleeful. Not even a senior assessor, Den continued. He tapped his console and projected the human's dossier onto the far wall, where it hung in the sterile light like a specimen under glass. Designation, Field Certification Specialist, Grade 3. Name. He paused, letting the room settle into its anticipatory hush. Ellie Briggs. Someone snorted. Someone else produced the soft Veshan clicking sound that meant delighted disbelief. Kess looked down at the holographic manifest on her own station. The Galactic Licensing Compact required every new vessel class to pass a 31-point technical audit before commercial operation was authorized. The audit team was supposed to comprise a minimum of 4 specialists, each covering their domain: structural, propulsion, environmental, and integrated systems. The humans had sent one person. One. I've reviewed her submitted credentials, Den said, flicking a talon across the display. She holds certifications in all 4 audit domains, plus a 5th that doesn't appear in our classification index. What's the 5th? Kess asked. The words escaped before she could evaluate whether junior technicians were supposed to ask questions during pre-inspection briefings. Den looked at her with the expression senior Veshans reserved for questions they considered adorable. A particular tilt of the crest and narrowing of the inner eyelid that Kess had learned to endure without flinching, but had not yet learned to stop noticing. Something called field expedient diagnostics, Den said. It has no compact equivalent, which means it doesn't count. The laughter rolled again, 9 voices blending into the particular Veshan harmonic that meant collective amusement at an absent party's expense. Kess studied the dossier image on the wall. The human was small, even by human standards. Brown hair pulled back in a simple arrangement. A face that looked, to Kess's Veshan eye, approximately 12 years old, though the file listed her age at 31 standard. She wore what appeared to be a soft, pale blue jacket over darker underlayers, a garment that looked like it had been chosen for comfort rather than impression. Not the formal audit armor the compact prescribed for Class 1 technical inspections, armor that took 20 minutes to properly seal and carried the subtle authority of institutional seriousness in every polished plate. Not the semi-formal variant permitted for lower-class assessments. Not even the minimum professional dress code the authority's interspecies protocol guide recommended for visiting assessors, which included, at bare minimum, species-appropriate formal wear and a visible authority-registered identification panel. The human was wearing what appeared to be the kind of garment humans put on in their living quarters when they had no intention of being seen by anyone whose opinion they valued. She's wearing a cardigan, senior technician Orval said, as if diagnosing a containment breach, to a Class 1 certification audit. The observation drew another round of crest-flattening amusement across the bay. Kess noticed that Orval lingered on the word cardigan, the way a medical technician might linger on the name of an improbable pathogen, savoring the absurdity of finding it in a clinical environment. Around the bay, the other technicians were exchanging glances that carried the particular warmth of shared certainty. They all knew how this would end. The pleasure was in the anticipation. Den closed the projection with a flick of his talon. Here's how this will go. She'll present her credentials. will run the 31-point inspection as required by the compact. She will fail to cover 4 domains simultaneously because she is one person, and the compact requires independent verification across domains. We'll issue the administrative hold, flag the filing, and the humans will have to send a proper team. Estimated delay, 6 to 8 standard weeks. Their new ship class sits grounded until then. Kes heard the satisfaction in his voice and understood what lived beneath the surface of procedure. This was not about safety, not entirely. This was about precedent, about territory, about a bureaucracy defending its expertise against an upstart species that had refused, from the moment of its arrival in the compact, to be properly intimidated by process. The Veshan Licensing Authority had administered the compact's certification procedures for 11 species across 40 years. They were methodical. They were thorough. They were deeply, structurally proud of their work in the way that institutions become proud when their procedures have outlasted anyone's memory of why those procedures were originally written. The authority was not corrupt. It was not incompetent. It was simply old enough and successful enough to have confused its methods with the underlying truth those methods were designed to find. And no one had challenged that confusion, because no one had needed to, because every other species in the compact had approached the certification process with the appropriate deference. The humans had joined the compact 18 months ago, and had, in that time, submitted more vessel-class filings than any species in the authority's 40-year history. 18 new designs, each one dense with unfamiliar engineering, cross-wired in ways that made Veshan technicians recheck their reference manuals and occasionally discover that the reference manuals did not contain the concept they were looking for. The filings were technically complete. Nobody could deny that. They met every compact requirement, checked every box, answered every question the forms asked. But they were written in a style that felt, to Kes, like someone explaining complex surgery using recipe cards. Functional, blunt, stripped of the formal technical language the authority had spent decades standardizing and polishing into an art form of institutional precision. The humans did not seem to notice they were doing it wrong. They did not protest or apologize or ask for formatting guidance or submit revised versions with proper terminology. They just kept filing. 18 designs in 18 months, each one landing on the authority's intake desk like a homework assignment turned in on a napkin, technically correct and impossible to fail, impossible to praise, and somehow impossible to stop thinking about. And now they had sent one person in a Cardigan. "Bay doors in 2 minutes," Den said. "Positions." Kes took her station at Environmental Systems, Console 4, and pulled up the inspection framework on her holographic display. 31 points, 4 domains. The minimum team size of 4 was not arbitrary. It existed because each domain required real-time independent observation during live system tests. You could not run a propulsion stress test and simultaneously monitor the environmental cascade response from the same console. The physics did not care about your multitasking skills. The physics did not care about your certifications or your confidence or your Cardigan. The physics required bodies in chairs, eyes on instruments, hands on controls. She glanced at a secondary window on her console where she had quietly pre-formatted the administrative hold notification during Den's briefing. The form was standard, one she had seen issued dozens of times since her arrival at the authority. She had already filled in the vessel class designation, the date, the filing reference number. All that remained was the audit result field where she had typed the word incomplete, because that was how this would end. Everyone in the bay knew it. The only question was how quickly the human would realize it too. The bay doors slid open with the soft hydraulic whisper that the Veshan authority maintained as a point of institutional pride. Ellie Briggs walked in carrying a single equipment case, a flat, scuffed rectangle roughly the size of a Veshan dinner plate. She stopped at the threshold line, looked at the 9 technicians behind their consoles, and smiled. The smile was unremarkable by human standards, mild, vaguely friendly, entirely immune to whatever atmosphere it encountered. It was the smile of someone who had walked into enough rooms to know that the temperature of the room was not her problem to manage, and who had long ago stopped trying. "Morning," Briggs said. Her voice was mid-pitched, conversational, without the formal cadences the Compact's protocol guides recommended for interspecies professional address. "I'm your audit specialist. Where do you want me to start?" Den stepped forward from behind his supervisory console. His crest feathers were fully erect, the Veshan display of formal authority, a posture reserved for official pronouncements, ceremonial occasions, and the gentle delivery of bad news to people who should have known better. He towered over the human by a full meter. His formal audit armor gleamed under the bay's diagnostic lights, every surface polished to the institutional standard that 57 pages of authority dress code prescribed. "Specialist Briggs, the Compact requires a minimum 4-member audit team for Class 1 certification. You appear to be alone." "I am." "Then I'm obligated to inform you that the authority cannot accept a single assessor audit for a 31-point inspection. You're welcome to observe the facility, but the certification will be placed on administrative hold pending a properly constituted team." Briggs set her equipment case on the nearest flat surface and opened it. The latches were worn smooth, the corners scuffed from what looked like years of being set down on console edges across a dozen stations. Inside was a device Kess did not recognize, a compact unit trailing thin cables, with a display surface that looked hand-built rather than manufactured. The casing had a matte finish that bore the subtle marks of someone who had taken it apart, improved something, and rebuilt it, more than once. Beside the device, nested in a foam cutout carved specifically for its shape, sat a thermos. "That's your prerogative, Supervisor," Briggs said, pouring something from the thermos into a small ceramic cup she produced from the case's side pocket. Steam curled upward in the bay's conditioned air. The scent that reached Kess's olfactory ridge was bitter, foreign, and oddly pleasant, like the memory of a flavor she had never actually tasted. But the Compact's minimum team clause has an exception for assessors holding concurrent certification across all required domains, provided the licensing authority's own technical staff can serve as independent witnesses to the assessment process. Section 14, Paragraph 9, Subsection C, your 9 technicians qualify as witnesses under that provision. Silence. The specific, fragile silence that occurs when someone has said something that might be true and nobody in the room is prepared for it to be true. Kess watched Den's crest feathers perform a complicated maneuver, half raised and half flattened, a configuration she had never observed in 3 rotations at the authority, and could not find in any of the body language references she had studied during orientation. She suspected it meant he was attempting to project the appearance of someone who had always known about subsection C, and was merely verifying the human citation for procedural completeness. She suspected he was failing. "That subsection," Den said, each word placed with the care of a technician handling a component that might be live, "has never been invoked." "First time for everything." Briggs took a sip from her cup. The gesture was unhurried, almost ceremonial, the sip of someone who knew that the next few seconds of silence would do more work than anything she could say. "Coffee. Want some?" "No." "Your loss. Grew the beans in a station greenhouse outside Tau Ceti. It's good stuff." She set the cup down on the console beside her case and tapped her device. Its display lit up, and Kess saw, projected in crisp miniature above the hand-built unit, the complete 31-point inspection framework. Every domain, every test point, every required measurement, cross-referenced, annotated, and organized in a format that was simultaneously the most informal and the most comprehensive version of the framework Kess had ever encountered. The formal Veshan layout used nested hierarchies and color-coded domain separations, a system of visual organization that had taken the authorities' documentation office 2 decades to perfect. Briggs's version used what appeared to be a single flowing checklist with handwritten annotations in the margins, as if someone had taken the entire inspection apparatus and reorganized it according to the logic of how ships actually functioned, rather than how inspection committees organized their filing systems. I've preloaded the ship's technical filings and cross-referenced them against your authority's last 6 certification reports for comparable vessel classes, Briggs said, not looking up from her device. Found 3 discrepancies in your baseline calibration standards. Nothing critical. Your thermal expansion coefficients for composite hull segments are about 8 years out of date. Standard drift happens to every authority eventually. I've flagged them in my notes. We can deal with that after the audit if you're interested. Another silence, longer this time. Kess could feel the room recalibrating, not dramatically, not with the sharp intake of breath that meant alarm, but with the slow, grinding reluctance of professionals confronting the possibility that they might not be the most prepared people in the room. Orval leaned toward Kess from the adjacent station. His whisper was barely audible. Did she just tell us our calibration standards are wrong? She said out of date, Kess murmured back. That's different. Is it? Kess was not sure. She was beginning to suspect it was not. Point 1, Briggs said, tapping her checklist with a stylus. Structural integrity, hull segmentation and load distribution. I'll need access to the primary load-bearing scans from your records on this vessel class. Who's on structural? Senior Technician Fail raised a hand. His crest was carefully neutral, the Veshan posture for projecting neither confidence nor uncertainty while buying time to assess. I am. But I should note that the human filing for this vessel class uses a non-standard load distribution model that doesn't map to our reference framework. It may require independent mathematical modeling before we can verify the published tolerances against compact standards. The Briggs-Kato distributed truss model, I wrote half of it. Another sip of coffee. Pull up your scans. I'll walk you through the variants. Fail looked at Den. Den's crest was completely flat against his skull, the Veshan equivalent of a blank stare, the expression of a mind working very hard while the face refused to commit to any emotion. He gave a minimal nod, the kind that could later be described as either authorization or acquiescence, depending on how the day went. The audit began. Kess had expected confusion. She had expected gaps, delays, the inevitable moment when a single assessor hit the wall of simultaneous requirements and had to stop, step back, and acknowledge that the physics of 4 domains could not bend to accommodate one body. She had mentally drafted the incident report she would append to her pre-formatted hold notification. She had imagined the expression the human would wear when the hold was officially issued. What she got instead was something she had no framework for. Briggs moved through the 31 points in a pattern Kess did not recognize at first. It took 12 minutes to understand what she was seeing. The sequence was organized not by domain, not by the compact's prescribed order, but by physical location aboard the test vessel. Instead of completing all structural points, then all propulsion, then environmental, then integrated systems, Briggs worked deck by deck. On each deck at each junction, she addressed every domain simultaneously. Structural load paths, propulsion conduit routing, environmental system interconnects, integrated systems coherence readings. She would examine a component, pull data from all 4 domains on her hand-built device, annotate her checklist with a stylus that moved faster than Kess could track, ask the relevant Veshan technician to confirm the reading as an independent witness, and move to the next junction. It was exactly how you would do it if you understood how a ship worked rather than how an inspection framework was organized. The Veshan system separated domains because the bureaucracy was organized by domains. Briggs's approach treated the ship as a single integrated system because the ship was a single integrated system. The framework existed to verify. Her approach existed to understand. The difference, Kess realized, was not trivial. By point 5, Fail had reduced his objections to minor technical clarifications. By point 7, he had stopped objecting entirely and begun asking questions instead. Not challenging questions, not the pointed, procedural questions of a technician defending his turf and its conventions. Real questions, curious questions. The distributed trust model did not map to Veshin's structural engineering in any direct way, but it accomplished the same objectives with fewer structural members and more adaptive load paths. The design was lighter, more flexible, more tolerant of the kind of asymmetric thrust loads that Veshin ships handled through brute reinforcement. Fail wanted to understand how the stress tolerances held under sustained asymmetric output, and Briggs explained it in 4 sentences. No condescension, no jargon, no reference material. She knew the answer the way people know the answer to a question they have been asked so many times it has become part of their breathing. By point 10, Fail had pulled a secondary display from his console and was taking personal notes. Not audit notes for the official record, learning notes for himself. Kess had never seen a senior Veshin technician take personal notes during an active inspection. Kess noticed something else as the points progressed past 12, past 14. Briggs was teaching. Not formally, not with the elaborate pedagogical scaffolding the Veshin accreditation system required, not with preliminary learning objectives and staged knowledge assessments and post-module comprehension checks. She was teaching in the way a person teaches when they have done a thing so many times and so well that it has become transparent to them, and they cannot help showing the transparency to anyone who is paying attention. She would say, "See how this junction handles the thermal expansion differently than your standard design." And a technician who had been skeptical an hour earlier would lean forward and look, and what they saw would change the quality of their silence from dismissive to attentive. One question at a time. One junction at a time. The laughter dying not with a dramatic moment, but with the slow, accumulating weight of demonstrated competence. By point 14, the bay had changed. The transformation had been so gradual, so incremental, that no single moment marked the boundary between before and after. It was not like a switch being thrown. It was like a tide coming in, each wavelet indistinguishable from the last, the waterline advancing in increments so small that you only noticed when you looked down and discovered you were standing in water. The laughter was gone, replaced by professional attention in its purest form. The 9 technicians were still behind their consoles. They were still performing their roles as defined by the compact, but they were no longer an audience waiting for a performance to fail. They were colleagues observing a peer whose competence had quietly rewritten the terms of the encounter. Without anyone noticing the moment, the rewriting occurred. Kess minimized the pre-formatted hold notification on her secondary display. She did not delete it. Not yet, but she minimized it. Point 16 was the first cross-domain verification, a test where structural and propulsion readings had to align with intolerance under simulated maneuvering loads. It typically required 2 specialists working in tandem, calling readings to each other across the bay. Briggs ran both data streams simultaneously on her device, calling her own readings to Fail and Dulev for witness confirmation. Her voice never quickened. Her hands never fumbled. She switched between streams the way a musician switches between instruments, each transition seamless because the competence covered both. "You're sandbagging your filings," Fail said when the readings came in, both within spec, both above filed projections by consistent margins. "Standard practice," Briggs said. "Most licensing authorities get nervous when actual performance exceeds projections by more than 5%. They assume the instruments are drifting. We file conservative and let the field data speak for itself over time. That's a significant margin of unreported capability. It's a significant margin of not having to argue about calibration. We found the second conversation less productive." Vale's crest twitched. He was rethinking something, and the rethinking was uncomfortable. At point 18, environmental cascade response, Kess's own domain, Briggs appeared at her station. She set her device on the console edge with the automatic precision of someone who had placed that device on 1,000 consoles and pulled up the atmospheric scrubber diagnostics for the human vessel's life support array. Kess watched the data populate and experienced what she would later describe as professional vertigo. The recipe card filing style she had found irritating for 18 months was not sloppy. It was compressed. Every sentence carried the information of 3 Vetian sentences because it assumed the reader understood the engineering well enough to skip the derivation. The filings were not talking down. They were talking across to appear. The problem was that the Vetian authority had not been peer level. They had been evaluating from the outside, and the gap had been invisible because the authority had never considered it might exist. Environmental point 4, Briggs said, scrubber failsafe cascade, independent sensor confirmation at 3 points, readings here, here, and here. 3 data streams appeared. Your station should show matching values. Kess checked match to the 4th decimal, confirmed. Good, notice anything about the 3rd reading. Kess studied the output. The cascade response is faster than your projection, about 11%. Briggs smiled. A teacher's smile, the kind worn when a student catches the detail without being told where to look. The filing was conservative. System performs above spec. We sandbagged because most authorities assume fast means broken. Is that common, that assumption? You have no idea. Kess laughed. Small, involuntary. The laugh of someone recognizing an absurdity they have been living inside without seeing. For the first time in 3 rotations, someone had treated her as a fellow technician rather than a junior clerk. Point 20. Propulsion verification. Briggs demonstrated the harmonic cycling thrust system, and Dulev, the quietest technician in the bay, stood up from his console for the first time all day. The human drive oscillated its output in a controlled wave pattern that reduced engine mount fatigue by 30% while maintaining net acceleration. Dulev had stared at those specifications for 3 weeks. The numbers had looked wrong. They looked wrong because the concept was unfamiliar. The numbers themselves were perfect. That's elegant, Dulev said, his first word since entering the bay. Borrowed from atmospheric turbine design, pre-spaceflight Earth engineering. The physics was understood for centuries. We just scaled it up. Pre-spaceflight, Dulev repeated, in the tone of someone informed that windmill technology was outperforming interstellar drives. He sat back down slowly, as if the act of standing had cost him something, and the act of sitting required careful negotiation with his own professional self-image. Kess saw Orval, 2 consoles over, quietly pull up the human filing on his own display and begin reading it from the beginning. Not the structural sections, which were outside his domain, but the propulsion sections he had glanced at weeks ago and dismissed as non-standard. He was reading them now with different eyes. The same words on the same page, but the person reading them had changed, and that made the words mean something they had not meant before. Point 21. Propulsion endurance modeling. Briggs walked Dulev through the mathematics, and Kess watched something she would not have believed possible that morning. Dulev smiled. A small expression, involuntary, the kind that on a Vetian face looked like a crack in marble. The smile of a specialist encountering elegance in his own domain, from a direction he had never thought to look. By point 22, questions had lost their defensive edge. Orval caught Kess's eye across the consoles, and his crest performed a small ripple that meant I may have been significantly wrong about something. Point 23. Integrated Systems Coherence Pre-Check. Briggs explained to senior technician Rava how the human vessel's architecture wove its systems into a single responsive mesh, rather than treating them as independent modules with interface protocols. Environmental responded to propulsion changes in real time. Structural load paths adapted to thrust patterns automatically. The ship did not have systems. It had a system, singular. Rival listened with the expression of someone being shown a view from a window they had walked past every day without looking through. When Briggs finished, Rival asked a question that surprised Kess, not about the engineering but about the philosophy. Your species designs ships as organisms, Rival said. We design them as assemblies. When did you decide that an organism was better? Briggs considered the question with the same unhurried attention she gave to data readings. We didn't decide it was better. We noticed that the ships we built as organisms failed less often and recovered faster when they did fail. The decision was made by the field data, not by us. We just stopped arguing with it. Rival's crest performed a complex motion that Kess interpreted as the Vetian equivalent of a long, slow exhale. We might have noticed the same thing, Rival said, very quietly, if we had been looking at the data instead of the documentation style. It was the first time all day that a Vetian technician had said something about the authorities' own limitations, and the words hung in the bay's recycled air with a weight that had nothing to do with their volume. Point 24. Two things were now apparent to everyone. Briggs was going to pass every point, not by gaming the framework but by demonstrating fluency that made the framework feel like a children's exercise. And she was going to do it alone, with a hand-built device and a thermos, in half the time a four-person Vetian team required. Den had stopped speaking entirely, crest flat, talons motionless, the internal stillness of a person recalculating everything and finding the arithmetic no longer held. 25, 26. The recycled air carried coffee scent and the clicks of talons taking notes nobody had planned to take. At point 27, Briggs did the thing that silenced the bay. The cross-domain stress test required simultaneous monitoring of all four domains under peak load. It was the test the four-person minimum existed to address. One person could not watch four streams at once. Briggs reached into her case and pulled four cables from a compartment Kess had not noticed before, each one neatly coiled and color-coded in a system that did not match any Vetian standard but was immediately, intuitively readable. She crossed the bay floor with the unhurried stride of someone walking through her own workshop and handed one cable to Fail, one to Orval, one to Kess, one to Dulev. Each handoff was accompanied by brief eye contact and a nod, the kind of nod that between professionals means I trust you with this, and each technician who received a cable held it with a care that would have been unthinkable 6 hours earlier, when they had been laughing about a cardigan. I need 4 independent witnesses for this point, Briggs said. Her voice was calm, conversational, carrying no trace of tension or drama. Each of you monitors your domain's data stream during the stress test. I'll initiate and run the test from the vessel's engineering console. Your independent readings will constitute the official audit record under subsection 14.9c Standard Witness Protocol. I'll call the test start on an open channel. Any objections? No one objected. The word objection had, over the course of the day, undergone a quiet transformation in meaning. It had entered the bay that morning as a synonym for challenge, for pushback, for the authorities' institutional right to question and delay. It left the bay that evening as something closer to its original definition, a substantive reason to believe something was wrong. And nobody had won. Kess connected the cable and watched her feed populate. As she settled in, she understood what Briggs had done. The deck-by-deck approach, the engagement of each technician, the competence demonstrated point by point, all structured so that at point 27, when she needed 4 trusted witnesses, she had spent 26 points earning their trust. Not manipulation, nothing deceptive, every demonstration genuine, every answer accurate, every explanation offered without agenda, without conditions, without the particular edge that would have made it a performance rather than a practice. What Briggs had done was simply be so thoroughly good at the work, so patient in the execution, so generous with her understanding, That professional trust had formed as a natural consequence, the way sediment forms in still water, not because anyone willed it but because the conditions were right and the current was steady. Competence so deep it looked like strategy. The test ran, 4 streams, 4 confirmations, all within spec, 3 above it. The coherence score was the highest Kess had ever seen at the authority, not by a small margin, not by the kind of margin that could be attributed to measurement variance or favorable test conditions, by a margin that suggested the authority's existing benchmark for what excellent looked like might need to be recalibrated. Vail stared at his structural readings for a long time after the test concluded. Then he opened the authority's internal reference database, pulled up the current benchmark scores for integrated systems coherence, and placed them side by side with the readings Briggs's vessel had just produced. The comparison was not flattering to the benchmarks. It was not flattering to anyone who had set those benchmarks and believed they represented the upper boundary of what interstellar engineering could achieve. Our benchmarks are 20 years old, Vail said, to no one in particular. 18, Orville corrected. 20, Vail said. The current ones were adopted 18 years ago, but they were based on data from 20 years ago. The proposal to update them was tabled in committee. Twice. Nobody asked why it had been tabled. Everyone in the Bay knew why things got tabled in committee. Because updating benchmarks meant admitting that previous benchmarks were insufficient, and admitting insufficiency meant questioning the process that had produced them. And questioning the process meant questioning the people who had designed the process. And those people were now senior enough that questioning them required more institutional courage than tabling a proposal required institutional inertia. The committee had chosen inertia. Committees usually did. 28, 29, 30. At point 31, the final sign-off requiring the supervising authority to certify full compliance across all domains, Den stood at his console for a long time. The Bay was quiet with a quality of silence that had nothing in common with the morning's laughter. Briggs was packing her device back into its scuffed case with the unhurried movements of someone who knew how this ended and felt no need to dramatize the moment. She wound each cable with the particular care of a person who valued a tool she had built with her own hands. She sealed the thermos and placed it in its foam cutout. She closed the case but did not latch it, as if she knew there would be a few more words before she left and did not want the sound of the latches to interrupt them. Specialist Briggs, Den said. His voice was different. The morning's confidence, the practiced authority, the institutional smoothness, all of it was gone. What remained was something more careful, more honest, each word placed with the deliberation of someone speaking for the first time, rather than delivering lines they had rehearsed across a decade of identical briefings. Supervisor. Point 31 requires the supervising authority to certify full compliance across all domains. He paused. Not a dramatic pause, not a theatrical beat, but the genuine hesitation of a professional who has just discovered that the thing he was about to say carries more weight than anything he has said in 11 years of saying things with authority. In 11 years administering this process for the Veshan Interstellar Licensing Authority, I have never seen a single assessor audit. The provision exists in the compact. It is legitimate and properly structured. I should have known it was there. I did not. Noted. In 11 years, I have also never seen a perfect score. Cass felt the Bay go still in a way she would remember for the rest of her career. Not the gleeful stillness of the morning, when 9 technicians had been preparing to enjoy a human's failure. Not the tense stillness of a confrontation or a procedural dispute. A different stillness entirely. The one that happens when professional people recognize professional excellence that exceeds their own, and they do not yet have a word for what they are feeling. Shame was in it. Respect was in it. A quiet restructuring of assumptions was in it. The internal sound of 9 sets of professional certainties being revised simultaneously, without anyone needing to announce that the revision was occurring. because everyone in the room could feel it happening like a change in atmospheric pressure. "Your vessel class is certified for commercial operation," Den said. He tapped his console and the official Veshan authority stamp appeared on the projection wall, rendered in the formal gold-on blue that 40 years of institutional tradition prescribed. "Full compliance, all 31 points, no conditions, no flags, no rework." "Thank you, Supervisor." Briggs latched her case, picked up the thermos from the foam cutout. "About those calibration standards. I've sent your office a comparative analysis. 8 data points covering the last decade of coefficient drift. The shift isn't exclusive to human engineering. It affects your baselines across the board, every species you certify. Might save you significant rework going forward." Den's crest feathers rose, slowly. Not in the authority display he had worn that morning, the formal erect posture of a supervisor delivering a pronouncement. In something Kess did not have a Veshan word for, and the absence of that word felt like a finding in itself. It was the beginning of respect offered to someone you had intended to dismiss, which required, as a prerequisite, acknowledging the dismissal. It was the particular species of professional humility that a person can only arrive at by walking through their own certainty and finding it insufficient. And it looked, on Den's Veshan features, like something that hurt in a way he had not expected and would not forget. "We'll review it," Den said. "You will." Briggs paused at the bay door, her scuffed case in one hand and the thermos in the other. She turned back to look at the 9 technicians who had spent a morning watching their professional assumptions dismantle themselves one test point at a time. "The coffee offer stands, by the way. Next time I'm through this system, I'll bring enough for the whole bay. Station-grown Tau Ceti blend. You'll like it." Her gaze found Kess across the row of consoles. "You caught the scrubber variants. The 11% overshoot on the cascade response. That's a good eye. Most people miss it entirely." Then she was gone. The bay doors closed behind her with the same soft hydraulic whisper that had opened them that morning, and the sound that had once represented institutional order now felt, to Kess, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that had changed the meaning of everything written before it. The bay was quiet for a long time after that. 9 technicians standing at 9 consoles, 31 green checkmarks glowing on the projection wall. The faint bitter scent of foreign coffee still hanging in the recycled air. A smell that would, in the months and years that followed, become as familiar to Kess as the ozone-clean scent of the authorities' own ventilation. Because Briggs would keep her promise about the coffee, and the bay would never quite smell the same again. Fail broke the silence first, very quietly, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever had settled over the room. "The distributed trust model. I want to read the original paper." "I want to see the calibration analysis," Orville said. His crest was flat against his skull, not in the authority display, in chagrin. The specific Veshan chagrin that comes from realizing you made a joke at someone's expense, and the someone turned out to be the most capable person you had ever met. Dulev said nothing. He was standing at his console, staring at the harmonic cycling curves still displayed on his screen, with the expression of someone who had just realized that the thing he had been dismissing as noise was actually music, and that the music had been playing for 18 months while he stood in the room with his hands over his ears. Kess said nothing either. She was looking at the 31 green checkmarks on her console and thinking about the morning, the laughter, the dossier image on the wall, the word Cardigan spoken like a diagnosis. The pre-formatted hold notification with the word incomplete typed into the audit result field before the human had even entered the bay. She had assumed, they had all assumed, with the comfortable confidence of people who had been right about procedure for 4 decades, that one human in a pale blue cardigan and soft shoes could not do what 4 Veshans in formal audit armor could. She opened the hold notification on her secondary display, looked at the word incomplete, selected the entire document, deleted it. The console confirmed the deletion with a small chime, and the sound, in the quiet of the bay, felt like the period at the end of a sentence she should never have started writing. Around the bay, the other technicians were beginning to move, but slowly, as if the normal rhythms of a shift-in had become uncertain. Fail was saving his personal notes to a private archive folder Kess had never seen him use. Orval was rereading the calibration analysis Briggs had sent, scrolling through the 8 data points with the deliberate attention of someone who suspects that what he is reading will change how he does his job tomorrow. Rava had pulled up the authority's current integrated systems assessment methodology and was comparing it, point by point, with the approach Briggs had demonstrated, and the comparison was producing a series of small, involuntary crest movements that Kess interpreted as the Veshan equivalent of wincing. Nobody was laughing. Nobody had been laughing for a long time. Den was still standing at his console when Kess gathered her things for her rotation break. She hesitated at the bay door, then turned back. "Supervisor." He looked up. His feathers were flat against his skull, not in the formal authority display, not in anger or resentment, in something quieter, something older, something that looked on a senior Veshan's face very much like the specific kind of embarrassment that comes not from a mistake of procedure, which the authority had protocols for handling and therefore found manageable, but from a failure of imagination which it did not. The subsection she cited, 14.9c, did you know about it? A long pause. His talons clicked once against the console surface, a soft, involuntary sound. "I should have." Kess nodded. That was, she realized, the most honest thing she had heard a senior Veshan technician say in 3 rotations at the authority. It was the kind of sentence that cost something to speak, and the cost was visible in Den's crest, in his talons, in the way he stood behind his console as if the console were the only thing in the room he still fully understood. She left the bay and walked toward the mess hall along the station's curved corridor, her reflection sliding across polished wall panels in the pale blue institutional light. Her own reflection looked the same as it had that morning, the same junior technician in the same standard issue environmental systems uniform, but the person inside the reflection felt different in ways she could not have articulated if Den had put her on formal report and demanded a detailed account. She was thinking about cardigans and coffee, and the specific expression on a human face that means "I knew you would get there eventually, but I was willing to wait." She was thinking about the word incomplete and the ease with which she had typed it. She was thinking about Fail's personal notes and Dulev's one-word verdict and Orval's chagrin, and the sound of Rava quietly discovering that 40 years of assessment methodology might need rethinking. And she was thinking that the most dangerous thing about assumptions was not that they were wrong but that they felt so much like knowledge. That was 8 years ago. Kess Torallen, now Senior Certification Analyst for the Veshan Interstellar Licensing Authority, stood at the podium of the Accreditation Academy's main lecture hall on Vesha Prime and looked out at 200 junior technicians in their first week of training. They were arranged in the precise hierarchical seating the Veshan educational system favored. Senior cohort in the front rows, close to the podium, where eye contact and crest reading were easiest. Junior cohort in the back, where the seats were narrower and the view was a reminder that proximity to the front was earned. Everyone was in formal technical dress, crests groomed and raised to the standard erect posture that signified readiness to learn, readiness to be shaped, readiness to become what the authority needed them to be. They looked exactly like she had looked, 10 years and a career's worth of professional revision ago. "You're here," she said, "because you've passed the entrance examinations, completed your pre-accreditation service, and been deemed qualified to begin training as compact licensing technicians. Congratulations. You've earned your seats." She let them settle, 200 faces, crests high, young professionals waiting to be told what the job was really about, the way every cohort waited, and the way every cohort assumed, with the specific confidence of people who have passed examinations, that they already knew. In 7 months, you'll be assigned to orbital stations across 9 systems, where you'll evaluate vessel designs from 12 spacefaring species. You will be the technical authority that determines whether a ship is safe to carry living beings between stars. That is a real responsibility, and I take it seriously. The authority takes it seriously. The compact takes it seriously. You should too. She tapped her console. The projection behind her displayed a Veshan licensing bay. 9 consoles arranged in the formal arc, the compact prescribed. Institutional light falling across polished surfaces. The image every young technician in the room expected to inhabit for the duration of their career. Before we begin the curriculum, I want to tell you about the worst professional mistake I ever witnessed, and the best technician I ever saw. The junior cohort straightened. Crests rose another fraction of a degree. Kess knew what they expected. They expected a story about a legendary Veshan analyst who caught a flaw that everyone else missed, some heroic tale of procedural vigilance, or a cautionary parable about a technician who signed off too quickly and learned the cost. That was the tradition. That was what the Academy had always taught in its opening lectures. That was the shape of the story they were prepared to hear. 8 years ago, Kess said, a human walked into a certification bay on Orbital 7. She was alone. She carried a case the size of a dinner plate and a thermos of coffee. She was wearing a cardigan. Crests twitched across the rows, a wave of involuntary response to a detail that did not fit the expected shape, rippling from the front rows to the back like a disturbance in water. Good. Let them twitch. Let the story be uncomfortable before it became useful. The bay supervisor, a good technician, experienced, 11 years in the role, had already decided she would fail. The entire bay had 9 senior technicians. We had reviewed her credentials, noted that she was alone, noted that the compact required 4 assessors, and concluded before she walked through the door that the humans had made an error. We were comfortable. We were confident. We had pre-formatted the administrative hold. We were ready to issue it, flag the filing, and go to lunch. She let the silence do its work. The lecture hall was quiet enough that she could hear the environmental system cycling air through the ceiling vents, a sound so familiar in Veshan institutional spaces that most people stopped noticing it within their first rotation. Kess noticed it now. It sounded different when you were about to say something that mattered. She completed all 31 audit points, alone. In half the time our 4-person team's average. She scored perfectly. No conditions. No flags. No rework required. She used a hand-built diagnostic device that outperformed our standard issue equipment. She cited a subsection of the compact that the supervising officer, who had been administering the certification process for over a decade, had never invoked and was not certain existed. And she accomplished all of this while drinking coffee from a personal thermos and wearing shoes that belonged in a living room. The collective intake of breath moved through the hall like a change in cabin pressure. 200 sets of Veshan lungs responding simultaneously to a story that had just violated every assumption the room was built to reinforce. In the 3rd row, a junior technician's crest collapsed entirely, the involuntary Veshan response to information that does not fit any available category. In the back row, 2 cohort mates exchanged a glance that Kess recognized because she had exchanged a similar one with Orval 8 years earlier. The glance that says, "Did we just hear what I think we heard?" Here is the lesson, and it is the single most important thing I can give you before the curriculum begins. Every technician in that bay, myself included, looked at Ellie Briggs and decided, before she said a single word, that she was not a serious professional. She didn't look like our template for an auditor. She didn't dress like our template for an auditor. She didn't arrive with the right number of people or the right kind of equipment according to our expectations. She violated every assumption we held about how competence is supposed to present itself. She tapped the console. A graph appeared on the projection wall. Human vessel class certification records across the 8 years since the audit in Bay 14. 93 new designs submitted across the compact, all certified, all clean. Post-certification incident rate displayed in a single clear column, 0 catastrophic failures, 0 safety-critical recalls, 0 structural incidents. The lowest post-certification incident rate of any species in the compact's 40-year history, by a margin that was not close enough to require qualification. She was the most competent person in the room by a distance that should embarrass every one of us. It embarrassed me. I stood at my console that day with a pre-formatted administrative hold on my secondary display, the word incomplete already typed into the result field, because I was so certain of the outcome that I had prepared for it before the outcome had a chance to occur. That is not diligence. That is not thoroughness. That is the opposite of what this institution exists to practice. I am telling you this because I want you to feel that embarrassment now, in this room, in your first week, before you step into a licensing bay, and make the same mistake I made with the confidence of someone who has not yet learned what confidence costs when it is unearned. She let the numbers sit on the wall behind her, 93 designs, 0 failures. The numbers spoke in a register that did not require commentary, did not need narrative support, did not benefit from elaboration. They just sat there being true, and the truth was heavy enough to fill the room. The mistake was not that we questioned her credentials. Verification is our job. The compact requires it. It is the core of what we do, and it is important, and I would never ask you to stop doing it. The mistake was that we decided the answer before we asked the question. We confused our process with our judgment. We confused what competence looks like, according to our template, with whether competence is present. We looked at someone who did not match our expectations and concluded, on the basis of that mismatch alone, that she could not be what she was. She paused and surveyed the room, 200 faces, some confused, some riveted, some already wearing the expression of someone arguing with themselves internally, the crests slightly asymmetric, one side raised in attention and the other flattened in resistance. Good. Internal argument was where professional growth happened. It never happened when you were comfortable. Some of you will encounter human engineering in your first assignments. You will find their filings compressed where hours are detailed. You will find their methods unconventional where hours are standardized. You will find their personnel configurations unexpected where hours are prescribed. You will be tempted to interpret unfamiliar as inferior. I am telling you, from professional experience that cost me a significant amount of personal pride. Do not make that mistake. She tapped the console one final time. The projection changed. Not a graph, not a data set, a photograph. A thermos of coffee sitting on a console next to a scuffed equipment case. Kes had taken the image herself years ago during Briggs's third certification visit to the authority. She had kept it on her personal console ever since, not as a trophy, not as a souvenir, as a calibration standard, a reminder that the most important measurements are the ones you take of your own assumptions. This thermos belongs to the person who taught me the most important thing I know about this job, not about hull tolerances, not about thermal coefficients, not about the compact subsection index, about the difference between evaluating something and understanding it. She closed the projection. The wall behind her went to institutional gray, and 200 young faces looked at her in the kind of silence that means a room has shifted, and the people inside it have not yet decided how they feel about where it has moved to. One more thing. When Specialist Briggs left the bay that day, she told me I'd caught a scrubber variance that most people miss, the 11% overshoot on the cascade response. Kes allowed herself a small, precise smile, the closest thing a Veshan face could produce to the expression she had spent 8 years learning to recognize on humans, the expression that means I see you, and I think you might be worth watching. I have spent 8 years trying to deserve that sentence. I am still working on it. The hall was silent. Kess gathered her materials, set her console to standby, and stepped to the side of the podium. That concludes the introductory lecture. Module 1 begins tomorrow morning. Structural integrity, hull segmentation, and load distribution. Bring your reference manuals and an open mind. She looked out at the 200 young faces, crests high, attention locked, some already processing, some still resisting, all of them wearing the particular expression of people who had just been shown that the galaxy might not function according to the rules their textbooks described. And she added, quietly, "And if a human ever walks into your bay carrying a thermos and wearing something that looks like it belongs in a living room, pay very close attention. You are about to learn something your accreditation program never covered." She stepped away from the podium. The lecture hall erupted into layered murmur. 200 junior technicians discovering simultaneously that their assumptions about competence, about process, about the engineering hierarchy of the galaxy they were preparing to serve, might require significant revision before their first assignments began. Kess watched them from the corridor doorway for a moment. 200 young technicians in the middle of the particular discomfort that precedes growth, and she felt something she had not expected to feel: gratitude. Not for the discomfort itself, but for the fact that she had been the one to deliver it, and that she had earned the right to deliver it by living through the original version 8 years earlier, in a bay that smelled like human coffee and tasted like humility. She turned away from the hall and walked into the corridor. Her console chimed. Her personal console chimed with a new message, a routine filing notification from the authority's central intake office. She glanced at the header. New filing, Human Vessel Class HVR 2190 Designation Kingfisher Series. Audit Team, Specialist E. Briggs, Sole Assessor. Assignment, Orbital 7, Bay 14. Scheduled next rotation. Kess looked at the notification for a long moment. 8 years. The woman still traveled alone, still carried the same scuffed case. Still, Kess was willing to bet her certification on it, brought the thermos and the soft shoes and the quiet, patient, devastating competence that had walked into a bay full of contempt and walked out leaving respect in its wake. She opened her calendar, blocked out the full rotation date, typed a single note in the margin. "Bring coffee." She closed the console, slipped it into her jacket pocket, and walked toward the faculty wing with unhurried, precise steps. If anyone had stopped her in the corridor and asked why she was smiling in a way that the Kess Torallen of 8 years ago would not have recognized, she would not have tried to explain. Some things did not translate well into formal language, and the authority's formal language, thorough as it was, had not yet developed a term for what she was feeling. But she knew. It was the smile of someone who had watched contempt turn to shame, and shame turn, very slowly, into the kind of respect that only forms when you admit you were wrong and mean it. Somewhere out between the stations, Ellie Briggs was probably drinking coffee and wearing impractical shoes, and carrying a hand-built device in a case that had earned every one of its scuffs. And the galaxy's oldest and most thorough licensing authority was quietly, carefully, one cohort at a time, learning to keep up.